The doors of the great hall slammed open before Elena Marsh could stop shaking. Every head turned toward her at once, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the crackle of torches lining the stone walls. She stood frozen in the doorway, her hands cold, her heart pounding so hard she was sure the wolves around her could hear it. And they could. She had learned that much already. These were not ordinary people. Every person in this hall could hear her heartbeat, smell her fear, sense the sweat gathering at the back of her neck. There was nowhere to hide. At the far end of the hall, seated on a high stone throne carved with the shape of a snarling wolf, sat the man who was about to become her husband. Alpha King Damian Cross did not rise when she entered. He did not smile. He simply watched her, with sharp gray eyes that gave away nothing, as if she were a stranger who had wandered into the wrong building, rather than the woman fate itself had chosen for him. Elena had read about fated mates in old stories, back when she thought werewolves were nothing more than folklore. She never imagined she would become one. 3 weeks ago, she had been an ordinary woman, living an ordinary life, in a small apartment, above a bakery, working long shifts at a bookstore, worrying about rent, and nothing more dangerous than a broken heater. Then a stranger, with golden eyes, had grabbed her wrist on a quiet street corner, gone completely still, and whispered a single word that changed everything. Mate. She had not understood at first. She had tried to pull away, tried to run, but the man who found her, an older wolf named Corvin, had simply looked at her with something between pity and awe, and told her that the bond could not be denied, not by her, and not by the Alpha King it was tied to. Within days, she was taken from her small life and brought to Shadowfall territory, a place of endless dark forests and stone fortresses, ruled by a man who was about to marry her without ever having chosen her. Now, standing in that hall, feeling the weight of 100 unfamiliar eyes crawling over her skin, Elena understood for the first time just how far from home she truly was. "Approach," Damian said. His voice was low and even, carrying easily across the silent hall, without him needing to raise it. There was no warmth in the word. It was a command, nothing more. Elena forced her legs to move. She kept her chin lifted, though every instinct in her screamed to look down, to shrink, to disappear. She had promised herself on the long ride to this fortress that she would not let them see her fear, even if fear was the only thing she felt. Weakness invited cruelty here. She had already learned that much from the whispered comments of the guards who escorted her, the way they had looked at her like she was something fragile and slightly embarrassing, an accident of fate rather than a gift. She stopped a few steps below the throne. Up close, Damian Cross was even more imposing than she remembered from their first meeting. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair cropped close, and a jaw that looked as though it had never once softened into something gentle. His eyes moved over her slowly, taking in her plain traveling dress, her tired face, the way her hands trembled slightly at her sides despite her best effort to hide it. "So this is her," said a voice from the side of the hall. Elena turned to see a tall woman with silver hair and cold blue eyes step forward from a cluster of nobles. Her tone dripped with disdain. The great Alpha King's fated mate, a human. Laughter rippled through parts of the hall, quiet but unmistakable. Elena felt her face grow hot, but she kept her expression still. "Celine," Damian said, a warning edge creeping into his voice. "This is not the time." "When is the time, my king?" Celine Voss pressed, stepping closer, her gaze fixed on Elena like a predator studying prey. "Your father built this kingdom on strength. Your grandfather expanded it through strength. And now the fates have decided to hand you a mate who cannot even run as fast as a pack pup, who could not survive a single night in our forests without freezing to death, or being eaten by something far weaker than what hunts beyond our borders." She turned toward the gathered nobles with a thin, satisfied smile. "Tell me, does anyone here believe this woman will make a suitable queen?" No one answered, but the silence itself was an answer. Elena felt it settle over her shoulders, like a physical weight. She glanced at Damian, half expecting him to say something, to defend her, even a little. He said nothing. His jaw tightened, and something flickered behind his eyes, but he did not speak in her defense. He simply watched, as if waiting to see what she would do. Elena understood then, with painful clarity, that no one in this room, including the man she was about to marry, expected anything of her at all. She could have crumbled. She could have let the tears building behind her eyes fall, could have turned and run from the hall the way every part of her body wanted to. Instead, she straightened her spine, met Celine's cold blue eyes directly, and spoke in a voice that surprised even herself with its steadiness. "I did not ask for this bond," Elena said. "I did not ask to be pulled from my home and brought here to be judged by people who have already decided who I am, before I have said a single word. But I am here, and I intend to stay, whether any of you approve or not." A murmur ran through the hall, surprise this time, rather than mockery. Celine's smile faltered for just a moment, before she recovered, tilting her head, as though amused by a child who had said something unexpectedly bold. "Brave words," Celine said softly, "from someone who will not last a season." "Enough," Damien said, and this time there was real authority in his voice, enough to silence the hall completely. He rose from his throne, and Elena felt the shift in the room, the way every wolf present seemed to lower their gaze slightly in deference. He descended the steps toward her, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look at him. Up close, she could see the faint gold ring around his gray eyes, a mark, she had been told, of an alpha's bloodline. He studied her for a long moment, and she forced herself not to look away, though her pulse hammered in her throat. "The bond is real," Damien said, addressing the hall without taking his eyes off her. "I did not choose it, and I suspect she did not either. But it exists, and fate does not offer explanations for its choices. We will proceed with the union as planned." He paused, and his next words were quieter, meant for her alone, though she suspected everyone in the hall could still hear them. "Do not mistake this for anything more than duty. I will not pretend affection I do not feel. But you will be protected here as my wife, and you will conduct yourself in a manner that does not embarrass this kingdom." But Elena nodded once, refusing to let the sting of his words show on her face. "I understand," she said. He studied her a moment longer, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, before he turned and walked back toward his throne without another word. The audience was over. Guards moved forward to escort her away, and Elena allowed herself to be led out of the hall, spine straight, head high, though inside she felt as though she were made of glass, one wrong movement away from shattering completely. The room she was given was in a far wing of the fortress, distant enough from the main halls that she suspected it had been chosen deliberately, to keep her separate from the pack's daily life. It was large and cold, with heavy stone walls and a single window that looked out over the dark tree line stretching endlessly toward the horizon. A woman named Petra, assigned as her attendant, showed her the room with brisk efficiency and little warmth. "Meals are brought at set times," Petra said, adjusting the curtains without meeting Elena's eyes. "You are not to wander the fortress without escort. The Alpha King has matters of the kingdom to attend to, and will not have time to entertain questions about customs you do not understand. If you require something, ring the bell by the door, and someone will come when they are able." "Thank you," Elena said, though the words felt hollow in the vast, empty room. Petra paused at the door, finally looking at her directly for the first time. There was no cruelty in her expression, but there was no comfort either, only a kind of tired pragmatism. "A word of advice," she said. "Do not make trouble. The nobles are already looking for reasons to doubt you. Give them none, and perhaps they will grow bored of watching you eventually." The door closed, and Elena was alone. She sat on the edge of the enormous bed, the silence of the room pressing in around her, and allowed herself, finally, a single shaking breath. She thought of her small apartment back home, the smell of fresh bread drifting up from the bakery each morning, the easy comfort of a life where the biggest danger she faced was an overdue library book. That life felt impossibly far away now, as though it belonged to a different person entirely. But crying would not help her. Feeling sorry for herself would not help her either. If there was one thing Elena had learned in her 26 years of ordinary human life, it was that self-pity solved nothing, while quiet determination sometimes solved everything. She rose from the bed and walked to the window, studying the dark forest beyond the fortress walls. Somewhere out there, she had been told, other packs lived, other kingdoms with their own rulers, their own rivalries, their own dangers. She did not yet understand the politics of this world, the alliances and threats that shaped it, but she intended to learn, whether anyone here wished to teach her or not. Over the following days, Elena kept mostly to herself, observing the rhythms of the fortress from the edges. She noticed how the guards moved in careful hierarchies, how certain wolves lowered their eyes around others, how the entire pack seemed to organize itself around invisible lines of strength and status that she could not yet read. She noticed, too, how little anyone expected of her. Servants brought her meals and left quickly. Guards escorted her on short walks through the fortress gardens, but discouraged conversation. No one asked her opinion on anything, and no one seemed to think she had one worth hearing. Damien, for his part, remained a distant, unreadable presence. She saw him occasionally in passing, always surrounded by advisors, always moving with the brisk efficiency of a man who carried the weight of an entire kingdom on his shoulders. He did not seek her out, and she did not seek him out either, though she caught him once, across the length of a long corridor, watching her with an expression she could not quite name before he turned away and continued on with whatever business consumed his attention. She began, in the quiet hours when no one was watching, to study. She found an old library within the fortress, tucked away in a rarely used wing, filled with dusty volumes on pack law, territorial history, and the customs of the wolf kingdoms. Petra had not explicitly forbidden her from the library, and so Elena took that as permission enough. She spent hours there each day, poring over texts that explained the delicate balance of power between rival alpha kings, the meaning of formal duels, the weight given to bloodlines and displays of strength. It was slow going. Much of the language was archaic, filled with terms she had never encountered before. But she was patient, and she was determined, and slowly, piece by piece, she began to understand the shape of the world she had been thrown into. She learned that Shadowfall was one of several major wolf kingdoms in the region, bound together by old treaties and older grudges. She learned that an alpha king's mate was expected to embody certain virtues, strength chief among them, and that a human mate was seen by many as a mark of weakness, in a king who was already, in the eyes of some rivals, too young and too untested to hold his throne securely. She learned, too, about a neighboring kingdom called Ashbourne, ruled by an alpha king named Kale, whose name was spoken in the fortress halls with a mixture of respect and unease. Ashbourne bordered Shadowfall territory along a long stretch of contested forest, and the two kingdoms had circled each other warily for years, neither quite willing to provoke open conflict, though tensions simmered beneath the surface of every formal exchange between them. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, Elena sat by the library window as the sun set over the dark trees, a heavy book open in her lap, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, startled, to find Damien standing in the doorway, watching her with an expression she could not read. "You come here often," he said. It was not quite a question. Elena straightened, closing the book gently. "I did not think anyone would mind." "No one minds," he said. "I am simply surprised." He stepped further into the room, his gaze drifting over the shelves, the scattered books she had pulled and left stacked on a nearby table. Most who find themselves unexpectedly bound to this life prefer to avoid learning its harder truths. "I would rather understand what I am part of," Elena said, "than remain ignorant of it." Something shifted in his expression, subtle enough that she almost missed it. He studied her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, before he spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "Pack law, territorial treaties, these are not simple subjects, even for those born into this world." "I have time," Elena said simply, "and very little else expected of me." He did not respond to that, though something about the set of his jaw suggested her words had landed somewhere he had not expected. He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway, glancing back at her. "The evening meal will be served shortly," he said. "You should not miss it." It was not warmth, not exactly, but it was, Elena thought, as she watched him go, the first time he had spoken to her, as though she were a person worth addressing directly, rather than an obligation to be managed. It was a small thing, but in the vast, cold fortress that had become her new home, she found herself holding on to it, turning it over in her mind long after the sound of his footsteps had faded down the corridor. She did not yet know what kind of life awaited her here, surrounded by wolves who doubted her, bound to a king who did not want her, threatened by kingdoms and rivals she was only beginning to understand. But as she gathered her books and made her way toward the dining hall, Elena Marsh made herself a quiet promise. She would not simply survive this world, she would learn it, master it, and prove to every doubting eye in that great stone hall that fate had not made a mistake in choosing her, no matter how small and human she seemed, standing among wolves. Whatever came next, she would meet it standing tall. The morning of the wedding arrived gray and cold, the kind of morning that seemed to match the mood inside the fortress, rather than any joy the day was supposed to hold. Elena stood in front of a tall mirror, while two attendants fastened the final clasps of a heavy silver gown, its fabric stiff and formal, nothing like anything she had worn in her old life. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. "You look every part a queen," one of the attendants said, though her tone carried more duty than sincerity. Elena said nothing. She studied her own reflection, the careful braids pinned at her temples, the pale color of her face despite the rouge applied to her cheeks. She did not feel like a queen. She felt like a woman being prepared for an exam she had not studied for, surrounded by people quietly certain she would fail. Petra entered the room without knocking, her expression unreadable as always. "It is time," she said simply. The ceremony was held in the same great hall where Elena had first stood before the assembled nobles 2 weeks earlier. This time, the hall was filled beyond capacity. Wolves from every corner of Shadowfall territory gathered to witness the union, along with a scattering of guests from allied kingdoms who had traveled for the occasion, their expressions ranging from polite curiosity to open skepticism. Elena walked the long aisle alone. There was no one from her old life present to walk beside her. No family, no friends. Nothing familiar in the sea of unfamiliar faces watching her every step. She kept her eyes fixed on Damien, who stood waiting at the far end of the hall in formal dark robes, his expression composed into something that might have passed for calm to anyone who did not look closely enough to see the tension in his shoulders. The ceremony itself was brief and formal, conducted by an elderly wolf official who spoke ancient words Elena had practiced but did not fully understand. She repeated her vows when prompted, her voice steady, despite the tremor she felt beneath her ribs. Damien's voice, when he spoke his own vows, was even and controlled, giving away nothing of what he might have been feeling underneath. When the ceremony concluded, and the official pronounced them bound as mates before pack and kingdom, a ripple of polite applause moved through the hall, though Elena could hear, beneath it, the quiet murmur of doubt that had followed her since her arrival. She caught sight of Celine Voss near the front of the gathered nobles, her expression carefully neutral, though her cold blue eyes tracked Elena with an intensity that made her skin prickle. The feast that followed was a grand affair, long tables laden with food Elena barely tasted, music playing from a corner of the hall, nobles rising periodically to offer formal toasts filled with careful, diplomatic language that said little of true warmth. Elena sat beside Damien at the head table, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, yet the distance between them felt vast and immovable. "You handled the ceremony well," Damien said at one point, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it over the noise of the hall. "Thank you," Elena replied, unsure what else to say. He did not offer further conversation, and she did not press for it. They sat together through the long feast, like two strangers forced to share a table, exchanging only the barest necessary words, while around them, the pack celebrated a union neither of them had chosen. Later that evening, after the feast had wound down and the guests had begun to disperse, Damien escorted her, with careful formality, back toward the private wing of the fortress. He stopped at a fork in the corridor, and Elena realized with a small jolt that they were not, in fact, walking toward the same rooms. "Your chambers are this way," he said, gesturing down a different hall than the one leading toward what she assumed were his own quarters. "I have arranged separate rooms. I thought it would be more comfortable for you, given the circumstances." Elena kept her expression neutral, though something in her chest tightened at the clear message beneath his careful words. This was, after all, a marriage of obligation, not affection, and he had made no secret of that from the very beginning. Still, some small, foolish part of her had hoped the day might have shifted something between them, even slightly. "Of course," she said. "Thank you for the consideration." He studied her for a moment, something flickering behind his composed expression, before he inclined his head and turned to walk toward his own wing without further words. Elena watched him go, then made her way alone, toward her new chambers, larger and more richly furnished than her previous room, but no less cold for all its finery. The following days settled into a strange new rhythm. As Damien's wife, Elena was granted slightly more freedom to move through the fortress, though she quickly learned that freedom did not translate into acceptance. She was assigned a formal handler, a stern older wolf named Garrick, whose primary task, it seemed, was to ensure she did not embarrass the throne through ignorance of pack customs. "You will observe the council sessions from the gallery," Garrick informed her on her first morning under his instruction, his tone brisk and impatient. "You will not speak unless directly addressed. You will not offer opinions on matters of pack governance. Your role, Lady Elena, is to be present, not to participate." Elena bristled internally at the clear condescension in his words but kept her expression composed. "Understood," she said simply, filing away the resentment to examine later, in the privacy of her own thoughts. The council sessions were held in a formal chamber adjoining the Great Hall, where Damien sat at the head of a long table surrounded by advisors and senior pack members, discussing matters ranging from resource allocation to border patrols to the delicate diplomacy required in managing relationships with neighboring kingdoms. Elena sat in the gallery above, technically present but effectively invisible, listening carefully to every word while pretending, for the sake of appearances, to have little interest in the proceedings. She learned more in those silent hours of observation than she had in all her library research combined. She learned the names of Damien's chief advisors, the tensions that simmered beneath certain alliances, the careful language used to discuss the growing unease along the border with Ashbourne territory. She began, slowly, to understand not just the shape of pack law, but the living, breathing politics that shaped every decision made within these walls. One afternoon, as the council session concluded and the chamber began to empty, Elena remained seated in the gallery, absorbed in her thoughts, until she realized Damien had climbed the stairs and was standing a short distance away, watching her with an expression of quiet curiosity. "You take detailed notes," he observed, glancing at the small journal she had taken to carrying, filled with her careful observations from each session. Elena closed the journal, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "I find it easier to understand what I do not know when I write it down." "Garrick tells me you have not spoken a single word out of turn in 3 weeks of sessions," Damien said. There was something almost like approval in his tone, though he seemed to catch himself before it could fully surface. "Most find the restraint difficult." "I would rather listen and understand," Elena said, "than speak and reveal how much I still do not know." He studied her for a long moment, and she found herself unable to read the expression that crossed his face, somewhere between reassessment and reluctant respect. "That is a wiser approach than most possess," he said finally, "wolf or human." It was, Elena thought, as she watched him turn and descend the stairs once more, the second time he had spoken to her, as though her thoughts carried genuine weight. It was still not warmth, not affection, nothing close to what a marriage might have meant in her old life. But it was something, a small crack of possibility, in the cold, distant wall he had built around himself since the moment she arrived. She did not yet know if that crack would widen into anything more, or if it would remain simply a passing moment of grudging respect, forgotten by the following week. But she found herself, in the quiet privacy of her own chambers that evening, allowing herself a small measure of hope, fragile and uncertain, that perhaps this marriage of convenience might yet become something more than the obligation it had begun as. Outside her window, the dark forest stretched endlessly toward the horizon, hiding within its depths dangers and rivalries she was only beginning to understand. Somewhere beyond those trees, an entirely different kingdom watched Shadowfall with calculating eyes, waiting for any sign of weakness to exploit. Elena did not yet know how soon that danger would arrive at her doorstep, or how much her quiet resolve would be tested in the trials still ahead of her. But for now, in the fragile peace of her new chambers, she allowed herself simply to breathe, to rest, and to gather her strength for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. The invitation arrived on a cool morning nearly a month after the wedding, carried by a formal messenger from the Voss family, requesting the presence of the Alpha King and his new queen at a gathering meant to celebrate the harvest season. Garrick informed Elena that attendance was not optional. The Voss family held significant influence among the Shadowfall nobility, and any perceived slight, even an accidental one, could ripple outward into political consequences neither she nor Damien could afford. "Celine Voss will be present," Garrick added, his tone carefully neutral. though Elena caught the flicker of warning in his eyes. You would do well to remain composed, whatever occurs. Elena had not forgotten Celine's cold words on the day of her arrival, nor the way the woman's gaze had tracked her throughout the wedding feast, with barely concealed disdain. She suspected the gathering would offer little relief from that hostility, but she had grown accustomed, over the past month, to enduring quiet judgment with a steady face. She told herself this evening would be no different. She was wrong. The gathering was held in the grand courtyard of the Voss estate, strung with warm lanterns, and filled with the scent of roasted meats and autumn spices. Elena arrived beside Damien, dressed in a deep green gown that Petra had chosen for the occasion, and for the first hour, the evening passed with the same careful, distant politeness she had grown used to among the Shadowfall nobility. Nobles offered brief, formal greetings, their eyes assessing her with poorly hidden curiosity, before moving on to more comfortable conversations among their own circles. It was near the height of the evening, as musicians played and the courtyard filled with the low hum of conversation, that Celine approached, a glass of dark wine in hand, her silver hair catching the lantern light as she moved with the easy confidence of someone who had never once doubted her place in the world. "Lady Elena," Celine said, her tone honeyed with false warmth, "how wonderful that you could join us. I understand human customs regarding formal gatherings differ greatly from our own. I do hope you are not too overwhelmed." "I am managing well enough," Elena replied evenly, refusing to give Celine the reaction she was clearly hoping for. Celine's smile widened, sharp at the edges. "How resilient of you." She glanced past Elena toward a small cluster of nobles nearby, raising her voice just enough to ensure they could hear. "Tell me, Lady Elena, is it true that humans cannot sense danger the way we do? That your kind must rely entirely on your eyes and ears, with no instinct at all to warn you when something dangerous draws near?" Elena felt the weight of several gazes turning toward her, curious and expectant. "I suppose we rely on different strengths," she said carefully. "Different strengths," Celine repeated, as though tasting the words and finding them amusing. "How diplomatic. Though I confess, I struggle to name a single strength a human might offer a kingdom such as ours." She stepped closer, lowering her voice into something almost intimate, though still pitched to carry. "You cannot run as fast as us. You cannot heal as quickly. Your senses are dull compared to even the youngest pack pup. If danger came for you tonight, in this very courtyard, you would not even sense it approaching until it was standing directly before you." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the small gathered crowd, and Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, despite her best effort to remain composed. She glanced toward Damien, who stood a short distance away, deep in conversation with several older nobles, seemingly unaware of the exchange unfolding nearby. Or perhaps, she thought with a sinking feeling, he was simply choosing not to notice. "I did not realize strength was measured only by speed and senses," Elena said, keeping her voice steady, despite the tightness building in her chest. "I had thought wisdom and resolve carried some value as well." Celine's eyes glittered, sharp and amused. "Wisdom and resolve are lovely qualities, Lady Elena, in a scholar or a poet. But we are wolves. Our world is built on strength, on the ability to protect what is ours, to stand against those who would take it from us. Tell me honestly, if our kingdom faced true danger tomorrow, an enemy at our gates, a battle to be fought, what exactly would you contribute? Would you stand beside your king in defense of this territory, or would you hide behind these walls, waiting to be protected like a fragile, breakable thing?" The question hung in the air, cruel and pointed, and Elena felt the full weight of every eye now turned toward her, waiting to see how she would respond. She searched for words, but for the first time since her arrival, she found herself unable to summon a steady answer. The truth, humiliating as it was, sat heavy in her throat. She did not know what she would contribute in a moment of true danger. She had no training, no strength beyond her own stubborn will, nothing that would matter if this kingdom's survival ever depended on more than careful words and quiet study. "Lady Elena requires no defense," came a voice from behind her, and Elena turned to find Damien had approached, his expression composed, but his eyes carrying a coolness, directed squarely at Celine. "This gathering was meant to celebrate the harvest, not to interrogate my wife's worth to this kingdom." Celine inclined her head, the picture of gracious deference, though the satisfaction in her eyes remained unmistakable. "Of course, my king. Forgive me if my curiosity overstepped. I only wish to understand the woman fate has chosen for you. She offered Elena one last, thin smile before drifting back into the crowd, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. Damien turned to Elena, his expression unreadable. Are you well? I am fine, Elena said, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. He studied her a moment longer, something almost like concern flickering behind his careful composure, before duty pulled him back toward the waiting nobles who required his attention. Elena watched him go, and the sting of his earlier silence, his failure to step in before Celine's words had cut as deep as they had, settled heavy in her chest. He had defended her, eventually, but not before she had stood alone, exposed and humiliated, in front of an entire courtyard, unable to answer the one question that mattered most. What could she offer, if true danger ever came to this kingdom's door? She did not sleep well that night. Long after the gathering had ended, and she had returned to the quiet of her chambers, Elena lay awake, Celine's words circling endlessly through her mind. She thought of her old life, the small, safe apartment above the bakery, a world where the greatest danger she had ever faced was nothing compared to what lurked in the shadows of this new world she now belonged to. She thought of the fortress guards who moved with effortless strength, the wolves who could run faster than any human sprinter, heal from wounds that would leave a human bedridden for weeks, sense danger long before it arrived. She was, by every measure this world used, weak, and she was tired, bone-deep tired, of being reminded of it. Somewhere in the depths of that sleepless night, a quiet, stubborn resolve began to take shape within her. She could not change what she was born as. She could not grow claws or fangs or the effortless speed of a wolf, but she could grow stronger than she currently was. She could learn. She could train. She could build something within herself that no one in this fortress currently believed existed. She did not know yet how, or where to even begin, but the decision settled over her with unexpected clarity as the first gray light of dawn crept through her window. She would not remain the fragile, breakable thing Celine believed her to be. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. 2 days after the gathering, while wandering the fortress gardens during one of her permitted walks, Elena noticed an older wolf training alone in a distant corner of the grounds, far from the main courtyard where younger warriors typically sparred under careful supervision. He moved with a precision and control that seemed almost meditative, each strike deliberate, each movement conserving energy rather than wasting it in raw displays of strength. She recognized him after a moment. Corvin, the wolf who had first found her back in her old life, the one who had spoken the word mate and changed the entire course of her existence. She had seen him occasionally since her arrival, always at the edges of gatherings, rarely speaking, regarded by others with a curious mixture of respect and quiet dismissal she did not fully understand. She approached slowly, unsure whether she was welcome. Corvin paused his training as she drew near, studying her with keen, weathered eyes. "Lady Elena," he said, inclining his head respectfully, "you are far from the usual paths permitted to you." "I saw you training," Elena said, choosing honesty over careful deflection. "I wanted to understand what I was watching." Corvin studied her for a long moment, something considering in his gaze. "Discipline," he said finally, "not strength alone. Strength without discipline is simply chaos waiting to happen." "Could that be taught?" Elena asked carefully, "to someone without a wolf's natural strength?" Something shifted in Corvin's expression, a flicker of surprise quickly masked by careful neutrality. "You wish to learn to fight." "I wish," Elena said, choosing her words with deliberate care, "to no longer stand helpless when others question what I am capable of." Corvin was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her hold her breath. Finally he spoke, his voice low and measured. "I was once considered among the finest warriors in this kingdom," he said, "before an injury cost me the strength and speed that once defined me. The pack sees me now as little more than a relic, useful for training pups and little else." A faint, humorless smile touched his lips. "Perhaps that makes us not so different, you and I, both underestimated by those around us." "Will you teach me?" Elena asked directly. Corvin studied her a moment longer before nodding slowly. "Discretion will be required. The council would not approve of the Alpha King's human wife training in combat, however modest that training might be. If you are serious about this path, It must remain between us, at least until you have something worth revealing." "I understand," Elena said, and for the first time since Celine's cruel words in the courtyard, she felt something other than helplessness settle in her chest. It was small, fragile, barely a spark, but it was a beginning, and a beginning was more than she had possessed before. They began that very afternoon, in a secluded clearing far from the fortress's main grounds, hidden by dense trees and the natural quiet of the forest. Corvin started with the basics, teaching her how to stand, how to move her weight, how to breathe properly under exertion. It was slow, humbling work. Elena's human body could not match a wolf's natural speed or strength, and she found herself exhausted after even the simplest exercises, her muscles aching in ways she had never experienced in her old life. But she did not quit. Session after session, she returned to that quiet clearing, pushing through exhaustion, absorbing every lesson Corvin offered with fierce, determined focus. She began to notice small changes within herself, not dramatic transformations, but subtle shifts. Her endurance improved, her movements grew more controlled. She began to understand her own body in ways she never had before, learning to read an opponent's intentions through the smallest shifts in posture and weight. Corvin, for his part, seemed to grow more invested in her progress with each passing session, his initial reluctant agreement shifting into something closer to genuine interest. "You have an unusual gift," he told her one afternoon, after she had successfully anticipated and avoided a training strike that would have caught her off guard weeks earlier. "Most who begin training focus entirely on strength, believing raw power alone will carry them through any confrontation. You focus instead on understanding, on reading what comes before it arrives. That is a rarer skill than most realize, and far more valuable in the long run." Elena said nothing, but she carried his words with her long after their session ended, turning them over in her mind as she made her way back toward the fortress, careful to smooth away any evidence of her secret training before she returned to the watchful eyes that filled her daily life. She thought of Celine's cruel question in the courtyard, the humiliating silence that had followed it. She was not yet strong enough to answer that question with confidence, but for the first time since her arrival in this world, she believed, quietly and fiercely, that one day she would be. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of Elena's secret training became a quiet anchor in her otherwise uncertain days. She learned to move through the fortress with the same calm composure she always had, giving no hint of the hours she spent in that hidden clearing, her body growing steadily stronger, her instincts sharper with each passing session. But beyond the walls of Shadowfall, a different kind of tension was building, one that soon made its way into every conversation, every council session, every anxious glance exchanged among the fortress guards. Elena first sensed the shift during a council session she observed from her usual place in the gallery. The mood in the chamber was different that morning, tighter, more urgent than the measured discussions she had grown accustomed to over the previous weeks. Damien sat at the head of the table, his expression drawn tight with concern, as one of his senior advisors, a broad-shouldered wolf named Alaric, laid out a map across the table, pointing toward a stretch of contested forest along the eastern border. "Ashbourne patrols have crossed the boundary line 3 times this month alone," Alaric reported, his voice carrying an edge of frustration. "Each time, they claim it was an accident, a miscalculation of territory markers. But 3 accidents in a single month strains belief." "Kale is testing us," said another advisor, an older woman with sharp eyes and gray-streaked hair. "He wishes to see how far he can push before Shadowfall responds with force." Damien's jaw tightened. "And if we respond with force over disputed territory markers, we hand him exactly the justification he needs to escalate further." He studied the map for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "We will send a formal message reaffirming the boundary lines. No aggression." "Not yet. With respect, my king," Alaric said carefully. "Restraint has its limits. Kale Ashbourne has never respected weakness, and there are those beyond these walls who already question whether your recent marriage signals a shift toward exactly that." The words hung heavy in the chamber, and Elena felt her stomach tighten as every eye in the room seemed to flicker briefly toward the gallery where she sat, before returning to the matter at hand. She had suspected, in the quiet corners of her mind, that her presence carried political weight beyond simple personal humiliation. Hearing it spoken so plainly in the council chamber made the reality of it far harder to ignore. Damien did not respond directly to Alaric's implication, though something flickered across his expression. Tension and frustration held carefully in check. "We will continue to monitor the border," he said instead. "Increase patrols along the contested area, but under no circumstances are they to engage unless directly provoked. I will not hand Cale Ashbourne the excuse he is so clearly hoping for." The session continued for some time after that, discussing logistics and patrol schedules, but Elena found it difficult to focus on the details, her mind circling back repeatedly to Alaric's pointed words. She understood, with growing clarity, that her marriage to Damien was not simply a private matter between the two of them. It was a political statement, read and interpreted by every rival kingdom watching Shadowfall's every move, and apparently, in the eyes of at least some, it was being read as a sign of weakness. That evening, as the fortress settled into its usual quiet after the day's business concluded, Elena found herself once again in the small library, though her attention drifted repeatedly from the books in front of her toward the window, where the dark forest stretched endlessly beyond the fortress walls. She was still there, lost in thought, when Damien appeared in the doorway, his expression heavier than she had seen it in weeks. "You heard the council session," he said, not quite a question. "I heard enough to understand there is danger building at our borders," Elena replied carefully. "And that some believe my presence here makes that danger worse." Damien's expression tightened, though he did not deny it. He crossed the room slowly, settling into the chair across from her, weariness evident in the set of his shoulders. "Cale Ashbourne has ruled his kingdom for nearly a decade," he said. "He built his reputation on brutal, decisive strength, and he has little patience for kingdoms he perceives as vulnerable. My father maintained peace with Ashbourne, through careful, constant demonstrations of Shadowfall's strength. I am still young in my rule, still proving myself to kingdoms who remember my father's iron grip and wonder whether I possess the same resolve. And a human wife," Elena said quietly, "gives them reason to doubt that resolve." Damien was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes studying her, with an intensity that made her hold her breath. "Some among my own advisors have suggested," he said finally, his voice careful and measured, "that setting the marriage aside might strengthen our position. A political match with a stronger kingdom could reassure our allies and discourage Ashbourne's aggression." Elena felt something cold settle in her chest at his words, though she kept her expression carefully composed. "And what do you believe?" she asked, proud of how steady her voice remained, despite the sudden tightness in her throat. Damien held her gaze for a long moment before answering. "I believe," he said slowly, "that breaking a fated bond carries consequences beyond simple political calculation. Old texts speak of curses that follow an alpha who rejects what fate has chosen, weakened strength, shortened years, misfortune that follows the bloodline for generations." He paused, something more complicated than simple political calculation flickering behind his careful expression. "Whether those old texts hold truth or superstition, I am not willing to risk this kingdom's future to find out." It was not the answer Elena had hoped for, not a declaration of feeling or growing affection, but simple political pragmatism dressed in careful words. And yet, beneath the surface of his explanation, she thought she sensed something else, something he perhaps had not fully acknowledged even to himself. A reluctance that went beyond simple fear of a curse. "Then what happens now?" she asked. "Now," Damien said, rising from his chair, "we continue as we have. We give Ashbourne no excuse for aggression, and we demonstrate, in every way available to us, that Shadowfall remains strong, regardless of what form that strength takes." His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, before he turned toward the door. "Rest well, Elena. The days ahead will require patience from all of us." Left alone once more in the quiet library, Elena turned Damien's words over in her mind long into the night. She understood, now, the full weight of the danger building beyond the fortress walls, and the uncomfortable reality that her own presence sat at the center of a political storm she had never asked to be part of. She thought of her secret training sessions with Corvin, the slow, steady strength she had been building in quiet solitude, and felt a fierce new determination settle over her. She could not control the political calculations of kings and councils. She could not undo the doubts that clouded every eye that looked upon her. But she could continue growing stronger, quietly and steadily, until the day came when her strength could no longer be dismissed or ignored. Over the following weeks, tension along the Ashbourne border continued to simmer without fully boiling over. Reports trickled into the fortress of increased patrols, tense standoffs between border guards that stopped just short of open conflict, sharp diplomatic messages exchanged between Damien and Cale's advisors, each side testing the other's resolve without committing to outright aggression. The mood within Shadowfall's walls grew increasingly tense, guards more alert, council sessions longer and more fraught with urgency. Elena continued her training with Corvin whenever she could steal away unnoticed, her sessions growing more intense as her body adapted to the demands placed upon it. She learned to fight not with brute strength, which she would never possess in the way a wolf did, but with precision, strategy, and an increasingly sharp understanding of how to exploit an opponent's weaknesses rather than meet their strengths head-on. "You think differently than most warriors I have trained," Corvin observed one afternoon, watching as Elena successfully countered a training strike using leverage rather than force, turning his own momentum against him in a way that left him genuinely impressed. "Most rely on instinct alone, reacting to what is directly in front of them. You calculate 3 steps ahead, anticipating not just the current strike, but the ones that will follow it. I have always found it easier to think my way through problems than to simply react to them," Elena admitted, catching her breath after the exchange. Corvin studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful in his weathered expression. "That instinct may serve you better than raw strength ever could," he said finally. "In this world, brute force is common. Wolves are born with it, trained in it from childhood. But the ability to think clearly under pressure, to see patterns others miss, that is rarer, and in the right circumstances, it can overcome strength that would otherwise seem insurmountable." Elena carried his words with her as she made her way back toward the fortress that evening, the setting sun casting long shadows through the trees. She did not yet know what role her growing strength might eventually play in the tensions building along Shadowfall's borders. But she understood, with quiet certainty, that the doubts surrounding her, the whispers questioning her worth, the political calculations weighing her presence against the kingdom's security, would not be resolved through words alone. Somewhere beyond the horizon, in a kingdom she had never seen, ruled by a king she had never met, a storm was building that would eventually reach her doorstep. She could feel it in the tension that filled every council session, every anxious glance exchanged among the guards, every careful, measured word Damien offered when discussing the growing unease at their borders. She did not know yet what form that storm would take when it finally arrived, or what role she herself might play in weathering it. But she intended to be ready, whatever form it took. By the time the first frost touched the fortress gardens, Elena's training with Corvin had transformed from careful, halting lessons into something closer to a true discipline. She moved differently now, with a controlled economy of motion she never possessed in her old life, her senses sharpened through months of careful practice, even if they would never match a wolf's natural gifts. Corvin had begun introducing more complex drills, testing not just her physical endurance, but her ability to think clearly under pressure, to remain calm when exhaustion and frustration threatened to overwhelm her focus. "Pain is information," Corvin told her one bitter cold morning, after she had taken a hard fall during a training exercise, and pushed herself back to her feet without hesitation. "Most fighters, human or wolf, allow pain to control them, to dictate their next move through fear or instinct. You seem able to set it aside entirely, to keep thinking clearly even when your body is telling you to stop." "I have had practice ignoring things that hurt," Elena said quietly, thinking of the months of quiet humiliation she had endured since her arrival, the careful mask she wore through council sessions and formal gatherings alike. Corvin studied her for a long moment, something like understanding passing behind his weathered eyes. "That resilience will serve you well," he said. "More than you perhaps realize." It was during one of these training sessions, deep in the quiet clearing, hidden from the fortress's main grounds, that Elena first demonstrated a skill even Corvin had not anticipated. They had been practicing defensive maneuvers, Corvin attacking with measured, controlled strikes meant to test her reflexes, when Elena, without conscious thought, shifted her weight at precisely the right moment, redirecting the force of his strike using nothing but leverage and timing, sending the much larger, much stronger wolf stumbling off balance in a way that should have been physically impossible for someone of her size and strength. Corvin recovered quickly, straightening and studying her with open astonishment. "Do that again," he said. Elena, equally surprised by what had just happened, hesitated. "I am not certain I understand what I just did." "Instinct," Corvin said, circling her slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Pure instinct, combined with the months of careful technique we have built together. Most warriors spend years developing that kind of unconscious response, the ability to read an opponent's movement and react before their conscious mind has even processed the threat. You have developed it in months, not years." They tested the discovery repeatedly over the following weeks, Corvin gradually increasing the intensity and speed of his attacks, and each time, more often than either of them expected, Elena found herself responding with the same unconscious precision, absorbing and redirecting force rather than attempting to match it directly. It did not make her stronger in any conventional sense. She would never possess a wolf's raw physical power, but it gave her something else entirely, an ability to neutralize strength through skill and timing rather than confronting it head-on. "There is an old saying among the finest warriors this kingdom has produced," Corvin told her one evening, as the training session drew to a close and the last light faded from the sky. "Strength defeats weakness, but skill defeats strength. Few ever truly master what that saying means. I begin to believe you might." Elena carried his words with a cautious, guarded hope.
Oh?
Unwilling to let herself believe too fully in her own growing capability, before she had truly tested it against something more than careful, controlled training exercises. But something within her had shifted, a quiet confidence beginning to take root where only humiliation and doubt had existed before. Meanwhile, within the fortress itself, small shifts were also occurring in her relationship with Damien, subtle enough that she almost did not notice them until they had accumulated into something undeniable. He began seeking her out more frequently, not out of formal obligation, but seemingly out of genuine curiosity. She would find him occasionally in the library where she still spent her quiet hours studying, and rather than simply exchanging brief, formal pleasantries, he would linger, asking careful questions about what she was reading, offering context and history she had not yet uncovered on her own. One particular evening stood out clearly in her memory. She had been reading an old text on territorial law, struggling to untangle a particularly dense passage regarding boundary disputes, when Damien appeared in the doorway, drawn, she suspected, by the same restless energy that had brought her here rather than to her own quiet chambers. "You are frowning at that page, as though it has personally offended you," he observed, a faint hint of amusement coloring his usually measured tone. "This passage contradicts itself twice within 3 paragraphs, Elena said, gesturing at the offending text with visible frustration. "I cannot determine whether that is intentional ambiguity or simply poor writing." Damien crossed the room and glanced over her shoulder at the passage in question, close enough that she caught the faint scent of cedar and something else, something warm and distinctly his own, that she had never allowed herself to notice quite so clearly before. "Ah," he said after a moment, "that particular text was written during a period when 2 rival scholars were competing to draft the definitive interpretation of border law. Neither fully trusted the other's conclusions, so the final text became something of an uneasy compromise between their competing theories." "That explains a great deal," Elena said, unable to suppress a small laugh at the absurdity of it. "I have been trying to reconcile contradictions that were never meant to be reconciled." Damien's expression shifted into something she had rarely seen from him, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his usually composed features into something younger, less burdened by the constant weight of his responsibilities. "Pack scholars have argued over this particular text for generations," he said. "You are in good company in your frustration." They talked for nearly an hour after that, longer than any conversation they had shared since her arrival, moving from the dense legal text to broader questions about pack history, the founding of Shadowfall territory, the careful balance of power that had shaped the wolf kingdoms for centuries. Elena found herself, for the first time, genuinely enjoying his company, drawn in by the sharp intelligence beneath his careful, guarded exterior, the dry humor that occasionally slipped through when he allowed himself to relax even slightly. It was during a different moment, some days later, that Elena witnessed something that shifted her understanding of Damien even further. She had been walking through the fortress courtyard, returning from an errand, when she came upon a small commotion near the outer gate. A young pack child, no older than 6 or 7, had wandered too close to the training grounds and become frightened by the sudden loud clash of practice weapons nearby, freezing in terror as older guards rushed past without noticing her distress. Elena moved instinctively toward the child, kneeling down to her level and speaking in a calm, quiet voice, coaxing her attention away from the frightening noise until the girl's panicked breathing began to slow. It was a simple thing, requiring no special strength or skill, only patience and calm reassurance. But when she glanced up, she found Damien standing a short distance away, having apparently witnessed the entire exchange, his expression unreadable but intent, studying her with an attention that made her cheeks warm slightly. "You have a gift for calming fear," he said later that evening, when their paths crossed again in the quiet corridor outside her chambers. The guards who witnessed the incident spoke of little else for the remainder of the afternoon. Apparently few among them thought to simply kneel down and speak calmly to a frightened child, myself included. "It did not require any particular gift," Elena said, slightly embarrassed by the unexpected attention. "Only a moment of patience." "Perhaps," Damien said, "but patience is a rarer quality than you might realize, in a world built so heavily around strength and speed." He studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful and searching in his gray eyes. "I confess, Elena, I did not expect to find myself reconsidering my initial assumptions about you quite so thoroughly." It was the closest he had come, in all the months since her arrival, to acknowledging that his perception of her had begun to shift. Elena felt something warm bloom in her chest at his words, cautious and uncertain, unwilling to read too much into a single moment of unguarded honesty. But it was, she thought, as she made her way into her chambers that night, undeniably something. The following weeks brought a steady accumulation of similar small moments, each one chipping away, piece by piece, at the cold distance that had defined their relationship since her arrival. Damien began, without any formal announcement or acknowledgement, including her more directly in certain council discussions, seeking her perspective on matters where her outsider status, once seen purely as a liability, occasionally offered insight the pack's more traditional advisors overlooked entirely. "You see patterns we sometimes miss," he admitted to her one evening, after she had raised a question during a council session regarding a proposed trade agreement that ultimately revealed a flaw none of his senior advisors had noticed. "Your perspective, shaped by a world outside our traditions, offers something valuable that pure pack experience alone cannot always provide." Elena continued her secret training with Corvin throughout this period, her skills growing steadily sharper with each passing week, though she remained careful to keep this particular part of her life hidden from Damien and the rest of the fortress. She was not yet certain what she intended to do with the strength she was building, only that some instinct deep within her insisted the day would come when she would need it, and she intended to be ready when that day arrived. She did not have to wait much longer to find out. The tension along the Ashbourne border, which had simmered without fully erupting for months, began to shift into something far more dangerous during the depths of winter. Reports arrived with increasing frequency of Ashbourne patrols pressing further into contested territory, of tense confrontations between border guards that grew closer to open conflict with each passing week. The mood within the fortress grew heavier, council sessions longer and more urgent, and Elena could see the weight of it settling visibly onto Damien's shoulders, the careful composure he usually maintained growing increasingly strained beneath the mounting pressure. "Cale Ashbourne grows bolder," Alaric reported during one particularly tense council session, his expression grim as he laid out the latest reports from the border patrols. His advisors speak openly now of Shadowfall's weakness, of a young king distracted by an unsuitable marriage, unable or unwilling to defend what is rightfully his kingdom's territory. Damien's jaw tightened at the words, though his voice remained carefully measured when he responded. "Then we will remind him precisely how mistaken that assessment is." Elena, watching from her place in the gallery, felt a cold certainty settle over her that the careful, uneasy peace maintained along the border for so many months was about to shatter entirely. She did not yet know what form the coming conflict would take, or what role, if any, she herself might play in it, but she understood, with growing clarity, that the quiet strength she had spent months building in secret was about to be tested far sooner, and far more severely, than she had ever anticipated. That night, in the privacy of the hidden clearing, she trained with a new intensity, pushing herself harder than she ever had before, driven by a growing certainty that the peaceful days of careful preparation were rapidly drawing to a close. Corvin watched her with quiet approval, saying little, though the intensity in his weathered eyes suggested he too sensed the storm gathering on the horizon. "Whatever comes," he told her, as their session finally concluded, sweat and exhaustion visible on both their faces, despite the bitter cold. "You are more prepared for it than you realize. Trust in what we have built here, Elena. It is real, and it is yours, regardless of what any doubting eyes within these walls might believe." Elena nodded, gathering her strength for whatever trials lay ahead, unaware of just how soon, and how completely, her carefully built resolve would be called upon to prove itself before the entire watching world. The formal messenger arrived on a bitter morning 3 days after the tense council session, riding hard through the fortress gates with the unmistakable urgency of someone carrying news that could not wait. Elena watched from a high window as the messenger dismounted, immediately escorted toward the council chamber by a pair of anxious-looking guards, and felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach that whatever news he carried would not be good. She was not wrong. Within the hour, word spread through the fortress like wildfire, reaching her even before Garrick arrived, uncharacteristically flustered, to summon her to the Great Hall. "The Ashbourne King has issued a formal challenge," Garrick explained, as they hurried through the corridors, his usual composed demeanor cracked with visible tension. "A royal duel, to settle the border dispute once and for all. Winner claims the contested territory. Loser's kingdom submits to the victor's terms." Elena's pulse quickened. "And Damien has accepted?" "He has little choice," Garrick said grimly. "To refuse would be to admit weakness before every watching kingdom, an admission Shadowfall cannot afford, particularly not now." They arrived at the Great Hall to find it already filling with anxious nobles and advisors, the atmosphere thick with tension, unlike anything Elena had witnessed since her arrival. Damien stood near the head of the room, his expression carved from stone, listening as Alaric read aloud the formal terms of Cale Ashbourne's challenge from a scroll bearing the Ashbourne seal. "And in recognition of Shadowfall's apparent preference for softer virtues over true strength," Alaric read, his voice tight with barely contained anger, "King Cale generously offers an alternative. Should King Damien lack confidence in his own claim to the contested territory, he may instead send his human bride to represent Shadowfall in the ring. Surely, if human strength is truly equal to wolf strength, as recent unions might suggest, she should have no difficulty proving it." A stunned silence fell over the hall. Elena felt heat rush to her face, humiliation and fury warring within her, as the full weight of Cale's calculated insult settled over the room. It was not a genuine offer, it was mockery, dressed in formal language, designed to force Damien into an impossible choice. Either accept the insult of sending his wife to face certain defeat, or refuse and appear to hide behind his own claim, rather than facing Cale directly, admitting weakness either way. "This is an outrage," one of the older nobles said, his voice rising with indignation. "Ashbourne insults this entire kingdom with such mockery." "He insults us precisely because he believes we cannot answer it," Damien said, his voice low and controlled, though Elena could see the fury simmering beneath his careful composure. "This is calculated. Whatever we choose, Cale intends to use it as proof of our weakness." The council erupted into heated debate, advisors arguing over how best to respond to the calculated insult, some urging immediate refusal of the entire challenge, others insisting Damien must accept the duel himself, to prove Shadowfall's strength beyond any doubt. Elena stood at the edge of the gathering, largely ignored in the chaos, her mind racing as she considered the impossible situation unfolding before her. She thought of the months of secret training, the quiet strength she had built session by session in that hidden clearing, the unconscious skill Corvin had helped her discover, buried deep within instincts she never knew she possessed. She thought of Celine's cruel question in the courtyard so many months ago, the humiliating silence that had followed it because she had no answer to offer. She thought, too, of Cale Ashbourne's calculated mockery, the assumption woven into every word of his challenge that she was nothing more than a fragile, breakable thing, incapable of proving anything beyond her own weakness. Before she fully understood what she intended to do, Elena found herself stepping forward, her voice cutting clearly through the chaos of the council chamber. "I accept." The words landed like a physical blow, silencing the room instantly. Every eye turned toward her, shock and disbelief evident on every face, including, most notably, Damien's. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying a warning edge she had never heard from him before. "This is not a matter for you to decide." "With respect," Elena said, forcing her voice to remain steady, despite the pounding of her own heart. "King Kale's challenge specifically named me. I believe that gives me some standing in deciding how to answer it." "He named you as an insult," Damien said sharply, crossing the room toward her, "not as a genuine invitation. This is a duel, Elena, not a formal ceremony. Kale Ashbourne is among the strongest, most brutal fighters in this entire region. He would not hesitate to seriously injure or kill an opponent who stood against him, regardless of whether that opponent has any true experience in combat. And if you refuse the entire challenge outright," Elena said, holding his gaze despite the fear tightening in her chest, "what message does that send? That Shadowfall cowers rather than answers, even a calculated insult?" Damien's jaw tightened, the truth of her words clearly landing, even as every instinct in him rebelled against the idea. "There are other ways to answer an insult than accepting a duel that could cost you your life." "Name one," Elena said quietly, "that would not simply prove every doubt Kale and his advisors already hold about this kingdom's strength." The council chamber fell into tense silence, every advisor watching the exchange between them, with a mixture of astonishment and growing uncertainty. Damien studied Elena for a long moment, something complicated and unreadable passing behind his gray eyes, before he spoke again, his voice quieter now, meant for her alone despite the watching crowd. "You do not know what you are offering," he said. "You have no training, no experience against an opponent like Kale. This is not simple stubbornness, Elena. This is your life." Elena held his gaze steadily, though her heart raced at the intensity of his concern, so different from the cold distance that had defined their earliest days together. "I know more than you realize," she said quietly, "and I am asking you to trust that I understand the risk I am accepting, and that I am choosing it regardless." Something shifted in Damien's expression, torn between the fierce protectiveness she could see building behind his careful composure, and the political reality that pressed in from every side. He studied her for a long, silent moment, the entire council chamber holding its breath, before he finally spoke again, his voice heavy with reluctant acceptance. "We will discuss this," he said, privately, "before any final decision is made." It was not agreement, but it was not outright refusal either, and Elena accepted it as the small victory it represented. The council session dissolved into further heated discussion, advisors debating the political implications of every possible response, but Elena found herself largely unable to focus on the ongoing debate, her mind instead circling around the enormity of what she had just set into motion. She had spoken impulsively, driven by months of accumulated humiliation and a fierce, stubborn refusal to let Kale Ashbourne's mockery stand unanswered. But standing now in the aftermath of her declaration, the full weight of what she had proposed began to settle over her with sobering clarity. She would be facing an alpha king renowned for brutal strength, a fighter with decades of experience and physical gifts she could never hope to match in raw power. Corvin's training had given her skill, precision, an unconventional approach to combat that had proven surprisingly effective in their private sessions together. But she had never faced an opponent of Kale's caliber, never tested her abilities against anything beyond careful, controlled practice. Was she prepared for what she had just volunteered herself for? She did not fully know. But she understood, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she could not simply stand aside and allow Kale's calculated insult to go unanswered, not when answering it directly represented the first genuine chance she had been given to prove, beyond any doubt, that she was more than the fragile, breakable thing everyone in this kingdom had assumed her to be, since the very first moment she arrived. Later that evening, after the council session finally concluded, and the fortress began settling into its usual uneasy quiet, Damien found her in the small library, exactly where she had known he would look first. He entered without knocking, closing the door behind him, with a quiet finality that suggested the conversation ahead would not be a brief one. "Explain to me," he said, his voice carrying a rawness she had rarely heard from him, "why you would offer yourself for something so dangerous, without even consulting me first." Elena closed the book in her lap, meeting his gaze directly, despite the vulnerability the question exposed in both of them. "Because I am tired," she said quietly, "of being seen as something that requires protection, rather than someone capable of offering it. Because Cale Ashbourne's mockery was built entirely on the assumption that I am helpless, and I am done proving him right through silence." "There are other ways to prove your worth than risking your life against one of the most dangerous fighters in this entire region," Damien said, frustration, and something rawer, something closer to fear, evident beneath his carefully measured words. "Are there?" Elena asked. "Every path I have walked since arriving here has been shaped by doubt, by the assumption that I bring nothing of value to this kingdom, beyond an unfortunate fated bond neither of us chose. I have spent months proving myself quietly, through study and patience and careful observation. And still, the moment true danger arrives at our borders, the assumption remains the same, that I am fragile, that I am a liability to be managed rather than a partner to be trusted." Damien was quiet for a long moment, something complicated shifting behind his gray eyes. "You believe I see you that way," he said finally, and there was something almost wounded in the question. "I believe," Elena said carefully, "that everyone around us sees me that way, and that includes, at times, even you." She held his gaze, refusing to soften the honesty of her words, despite the vulnerability it required. "This is my chance to change that, Damien. Please do not take it from me." The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything neither of them had yet found the words to say fully. Finally, Damien crossed the room, settling into the chair across from her, weariness and reluctant understanding warring across his features. "If you do this," he said quietly, "you will need far more preparation than you currently possess." Elena felt something loosen in her chest at his words, relief and gratitude mingling with the fear still coiled tight beneath her ribs. "Then help me prepare," she said. "Truly help me, not simply tolerate my decision from a distance." Damien studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his careful composure, before he finally nodded, slow and deliberate. "Then we begin tomorrow," he said. "And Elena, I need you to understand something clearly before we do." His voice softened, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with politics or duty. "I am not agreeing to this because I have accepted the risk easily. I am agreeing because I have come, somehow, against every expectation I carried when this bond first found us, to care deeply about what happens to you. And that terrifies me far more than facing Cale Ashbourne myself ever could." The admission hung in the quiet air between them, unexpected and unguarded in a way neither of them had allowed themselves before. Elena felt her breath catch, something warm and fragile blooming in her chest, despite the fear still coursing beneath it. Whatever came next, whatever trials awaited her in the days ahead, she understood, with quiet certainty, that something fundamental had shifted between them in this moment, something neither of them could easily take back. Sleep did not come easily that night, for either of them. Elena lay awake long after Damien had finally left her chambers, his quiet admission replaying endlessly through her mind, its weight settling into her chest, like something both precious and terrifying. She had spent months bracing herself against his careful distance, building walls of her own to protect against the constant reminder that theirs was a bond of obligation rather than choice. To hear him speak so plainly of genuine care, of fear rooted not in political calculation, but in something far more personal, unsettled every careful assumption she had built to protect her own heart. She rose before dawn, unable to remain still any longer, and made her way to the small training clearing, out of sheer restless habit, though she suspected Corvin would not be waiting for her at such an early hour. She was wrong. He was already there, moving through slow, deliberate forms in the pale morning light, and he paused as she approached, studying her, with the same keen attention he always offered. "Word travels quickly within these walls," he said, without preamble. "I understand you have volunteered for something far larger than our quiet sessions here." "I have," Elena confirmed, settling into the familiar rhythm of stretching muscles still aching from the previous day's exertion. Corvin studied her for a long moment, something unreadable in his weathered expression. "Cale Ashbourne is not a training exercise," he said finally. "He is among the most dangerous fighters this region has produced in a generation. Brutal, experienced, entirely without mercy toward anyone he perceives as beneath him." "I am aware," Elena said quietly. Then you understand, Corvin said, that everything we have built together over these past months, while genuinely impressive for the time we have had, may not be sufficient against an opponent of his caliber. Elena met his gaze steadily, refusing to let the honest warning shake the fragile resolve she had built since the previous day's council session. Then we will need to build more, she said, in whatever time remains before the duel takes place. Something like reluctant respect flickered across Corvin's weathered features, and he nodded slowly. Then we begin now, he said, with far greater urgency than before. That morning marked a shift in the intensity of her training, each session pushing her further than the ones before, testing not just her physical capabilities, but her mental resilience under increasing pressure. Corvin introduced increasingly complex scenarios, forcing her to think and react under conditions designed to simulate the chaos and unpredictability of genuine combat, rather than the controlled, measured exercises they had practiced before. Word of the accepted challenge had spread quickly through the fortress by midday, and Elena found herself navigating a gauntlet of reactions as she made her way through the corridors, some guards offering cautious nods of respect she had never received before, others regarding her with open skepticism, clearly convinced she was walking toward certain disaster. The council reconvened that afternoon, and this time, Elena was formally invited to sit at the table rather than observe silently from the gallery above, a small but significant shift in her standing that she noted with quiet satisfaction, despite the tension of the discussion ahead. "This is madness," declared one of the older advisors, a stern-faced wolf named Dorian, who had rarely spoken directly to Elena since her arrival. "We cannot send an untrained human to face Cale Ashbourne in a formal duel. It invites disaster, both for Lady Elena personally, and for this kingdom's standing before every watching territory." "With respect," Elena said, keeping her voice steady, despite the weight of every skeptical gaze turned toward her. "Refusing the challenge entirely invites precisely the same disaster you fear, only without any possibility of proving Cale's assumptions wrong." "She is not incorrect," Damien said, and Elena felt a small surge of gratitude at his open support, so different from the careful silence he had maintained during Celine's cruel questioning so many months earlier. "Cale's challenge was designed to trap us regardless of our response. Refusal proves cowardice in the eyes of every watching kingdom. Acceptance by myself alone concedes that Elena's honor requires my personal defense rather than her own agency. Her acceptance, on the other hand, answers the insult directly, on precisely the terms Cale himself proposed." "And if she loses," Celine interjected sharply, her voice cutting through the chamber with familiar cold precision, "what message does that send, my king? That Shadowfall's queen could not even survive a formal duel against a rival alpha." "If I lose," Elena said, turning to meet Celine's gaze directly, refusing to let the familiar cruelty shake her composure, "then I will have lost, while fighting for something I believe in, rather than hiding behind walls built from doubt and fear. That is a message I am willing to stand behind, regardless of the outcome." A ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the chamber at her bold response, and even Celine seemed momentarily taken aback by the steady conviction in Elena's voice. Damien, watching from the head of the table, felt something swell in his chest that he recognized, with startling clarity, as pride, fierce and unexpected, entirely separate from any political calculation. The council debate continued for hours, advisors arguing over logistics, training timelines, the formal rules governing royal duels that Elena would need to understand thoroughly before the appointed day arrived. By the time the session finally concluded, exhaustion had settled heavily over every participant, but a decision had been reached, however reluctantly by some. Elena would represent Shadowfall in the formal duel against Cale Ashbourne, with the full support and resources of the kingdom behind her preparation. As the council chamber slowly emptied, Damien remained behind, watching Elena gather the notes she had taken throughout the long session, with the same careful diligence she had shown from her very first days observing from the gallery. "You handled Celine's challenge well," he observed, approaching slowly. "I have had considerable practice enduring her particular brand of cruelty," Elena said, a faint, weary smile touching her lips. Damien's expression sobered, something more serious settling behind his gray eyes. "I meant what I said last night," he said quietly, once they were alone in the emptying chamber. "About caring what happens to you. I need you to understand that clearly, Elena, especially now, as we move towards something that carries genuine risk to your life. Elena set down her notes, meeting his gaze fully. I understand, she said softly, and I want you to understand something as well. I am not doing this recklessly, or out of simple stubborn pride. I am doing this because for the first time since I arrived in this world, I have been given a genuine chance to prove that I belong here, on my own terms, rather than simply as an obligation fate assigned to you. Something shifted in Damien's expression, tenderness mixing with the fierce protectiveness he had carried since the moment she first volunteered herself for the duel. Then let me help you prepare properly, he said. Not simply through Corvin's guidance, valuable as it undoubtedly is, but through everything Shadowfall's resources can offer, our finest trainers, our most detailed knowledge of Kael's fighting style, gathered from years of careful observation along our shared border. Elena felt something warm bloom in her chest at the offer, gratitude mingling with a growing sense that whatever uncertain future awaited them, she would not be facing it entirely alone. I would welcome that, she said. Over the following days, Elena's preparation transformed from Corvin's quiet, solitary guidance into a more comprehensive effort, involving several of Shadowfall's most skilled warriors, each offering different perspectives on combat technique, strategy, and the particular challenges she would face against an opponent as physically dominant as Kael Ashbourne. Damien himself began joining her training sessions whenever his other duties allowed, and Elena found herself simultaneously terrified and exhilarated by the intensity of these shared hours, pushing her body and mind further than she had ever imagined possible. It was during one such session, as autumn deepened into the harsh grip of early winter, that Damien first began sharing pieces of his own past with her, unprompted, in a way he had never allowed himself before. They had paused for a brief rest between exercises, both breathing hard from exertion, when he settled onto a fallen log at the edge of the training clearing, his expression uncharacteristically open. My father believed strength was the only quality worth cultivating in an alpha, he said, staring out at the darkening tree line rather than meeting her gaze directly. He trained me relentlessly from the moment I could walk, convinced that any weakness, physical or otherwise, would eventually be exploited by rivals who showed no such mercy. I was rarely permitted to simply be a child. Every moment was measured against the standard of strength he demanded. Elena settled beside him quietly, sensing the vulnerability behind his uncharacteristic openness and choosing to simply listen rather than interrupt with questions. When my father passed, and I inherited the throne earlier than expected, Damien continued, I carried that same belief forward, perhaps even more rigidly than he had. I convinced myself that showing genuine care for anyone, allowing myself to become vulnerable through attachment, was simply another weakness waiting to be exploited by kingdoms like Ashbourne, always watching for any crack in Shadowfall's armor. He finally turned to meet her gaze, something raw and unguarded in his expression. When the fated bond first pulled me toward you, my immediate instinct was fear, not of you specifically, but of exactly this, of caring for someone in a way that could be used against me, against this kingdom. And now? Elena asked softly. Damien was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Now, he said, I find myself far more afraid of losing you than I ever was of the vulnerability that caring for you requires. The admission hung between them, fragile and honest, in a way neither of them had allowed themselves before, and Elena felt something shift fundamentally in the careful walls she had built around her own heart since her earliest, coldest days in this fortress. Whatever fear awaited her in the coming duel against Kael Ashbourne, she understood now, with quiet certainty, that she was no longer facing this trial entirely alone, bound only by obligation to a man who viewed her as burden rather than partner. Something real had grown between them, forged through months of careful observation, quiet respect, and now, finally, honest vulnerability. And as the day of the formal duel drew steadily closer, Elena found herself drawing strength not just from her own fierce determination, but from the growing conviction that she was fighting now not simply to prove her own worth to a skeptical kingdom, but to protect and preserve something genuinely precious that had somehow, against every expectation either of them had carried into this bond, begun to bloom between them. The weeks leading up to the formal duel passed in a blur of relentless preparation, each day beginning before dawn and stretching long into the exhausted hours of night. Elena's body ached constantly now, a deep, bone-tired soreness that never fully faded between sessions, but she pushed through it with a fierce determination that even Corvin, accustomed to training seasoned warriors, found remarkable. "You train like someone with everything to prove," he observed one bitter morning, watching as she rose yet again from a hard fall, refusing the offered hand and pushing herself back to her feet unassisted. "I have everything to prove," Elena replied simply, resetting her stance and gesturing for him to continue. Word of her rigorous preparation had spread throughout the fortress, and the reactions she encountered shifted gradually as the weeks progressed. Guards who had once regarded her with barely concealed skepticism began offering quiet nods of respect as they passed, some even pausing to watch portions of her training when their duties allowed, visibly impressed by the discipline and growing skill she displayed. Not everyone's doubts had faded entirely, but a grudging respect had begun to take root where dismissive condescension once dominated. Damien remained a constant presence throughout this period, joining her training whenever his duties permitted, and even when he could not attend in person, he ensured she had access to every resource Shadowfall's warriors and scholars could offer. He brought detailed reports on Kael Ashbourne's known fighting style, gathered from years of careful observation along their shared border, breaking down patterns in his preferred attacks, weaknesses that previous opponents had failed to exploit, tendencies that might offer Elena crucial advantages in the ring. Kael relies heavily on his raw physical power, Damien explained one evening, spreading a series of detailed notes across a table as Elena studied them with careful attention. He has faced few opponents in recent years who could genuinely challenge him, and that has bred a certain overconfidence in his approach. He tends to press aggressively from the opening moments, seeking to overwhelm opponents quickly, rather than pacing himself for a longer confrontation. "Then perhaps the key is not to meet that aggression directly," Elena said, studying the notes with growing focus, "but to allow it to exhaust itself, drawing out the confrontation until his overconfidence becomes a genuine weakness, rather than simply an intimidating strength." Damien looked up from the notes, something like admiration flickering across his features. "That is precisely the strategy Corvin has been building toward in your training, is it not?" "It is," Elena confirmed. "Though hearing it confirmed through your own observations of Kael's actual fighting patterns gives me far greater confidence that the approach might genuinely succeed." Their collaborative preparation deepened over the following weeks, Damien's political and strategic knowledge combining with Corvin's careful physical training to build a comprehensive approach unlike anything Elena could have developed through either resource alone. She learned to read subtle tells in an opponent's stance that signaled an incoming strike, learned to conserve her energy carefully through the early exchanges of a confrontation rather than expending herself too quickly, learned above all to trust the instincts Corvin had first discovered within her all those months ago, when she had unconsciously redirected his training strike using nothing but leverage and precise timing. It was during this period that Elena also began to fully understand the political complexities surrounding the upcoming duel, beyond simply the physical challenge she would face in the ring. Damien explained, during one of their quieter evenings together, the full weight of what victory or defeat would mean for both kingdoms. "If you win," he said, "the contested border territory becomes formally recognized as Shadowfall land, and more importantly, Kael's kingdom submits to accepting our claim publicly, before every watching territory. It would be a decisive blow to his reputation, and by extension, a significant strengthening of our own position among the Wolf Kingdoms." "And if I lose?" Elena asked quietly, though she already suspected the answer. Damien's jaw tightened. "The territory passes to Ashbourne control, and Shadowfall's standing weakens considerably. Some of our current allies may begin questioning whether continued alliance with a kingdom perceived as vulnerable serves their own interests." He paused, his expression softening slightly as he met her gaze. "But Elena, I need you to understand something clearly. Whatever the outcome of this duel, the political consequences matter far less to me than your safety. If at any point during your preparation, or even during the duel itself, you believe the risk has grown beyond what you are willing to accept, there is no shame in stepping back. I would rather face whatever political consequences follow than risk losing you." Elena felt the weight of his words settle warmly in her chest, gratitude mingling with a fierce determination that had only grown stronger throughout the weeks of preparation. I appreciate that, she said, more than I can easily express. But I do not intend to step back, Damien. I have spent months building toward this moment, and I believe, with everything Corvin and your own guidance have given me, that I have a genuine chance at victory, not simply a chance at survival. Celine Voss, predictably, remained a persistent source of skepticism throughout this period, her sharp comments finding their way to Elena through the careful gossip networks that flowed constantly through the fortress. She had apparently taken to openly questioning, among her circle of allies, whether the entire endeavor represented reckless foolishness on Elena's part or a calculated political maneuver by Damien to appear strong without genuinely risking anything of value. Elena encountered Celine directly only once during this period of intense preparation, crossing paths in a fortress corridor as she made her way toward yet another training session, exhaustion evident in her posture despite her best effort to disguise it. You look considerably worse for wear, Lady Elena, Celine observed, her tone carrying the same familiar cold amusement it always had. I do hope this elaborate display of preparation proves worth the effort, for your sake. I appreciate your concern, Elena replied evenly, refusing to let exhaustion diminish the steady composure she had worked so hard to maintain, though I suspect concern is not quite the correct word for what you are actually feeling. Something flickered across Celine's carefully composed features, surprise perhaps, at the directness of Elena's response. Confidence suits you, Celine said finally, after a long, assessing pause. Whether it proves warranted remains to be seen. It will, Elena said simply, and continued on toward her training, without waiting for further response, leaving Celine watching after her, with an expression Elena did not stay to fully interpret. As the appointed day of the duel drew nearer, the intensity of Elena's preparation reached its peak. Corvin introduced increasingly difficult scenarios, simulating the pressure and unpredictability of genuine combat as closely as controlled training could achieve. Damien, meanwhile, ensured she understood every formal rule and tradition governing royal duels, the careful ceremony that would frame the confrontation, the boundaries of acceptable technique, the conditions under which victory or defeat would be formally declared. On the final evening before the duel, as the fortress settled into an unusually quiet, tense stillness, Damien found Elena in the training clearing, practicing slow, deliberate forms alone in the fading light, her breath forming small clouds in the bitter evening air. You should be resting, he said gently, approaching from the tree line. I find it difficult to rest, Elena admitted, finally lowering her stance and turning to face him. With tomorrow weighing so heavily on my mind. Damien crossed the remaining distance between them, and for a long moment they simply stood together in comfortable silence, the weight of the coming trial settling around them both. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said finally, his voice carrying a rawness that spoke of emotions he rarely allowed himself to express so openly. I need you to know that these past months, watching you build yourself into someone capable of standing before Cale Ashbourne without fear, have changed something fundamental in how I understand strength itself. How so? Elena asked softly. I was raised to believe strength was purely physical, Damien said. Raw power measured in speed and force, inherited through bloodline rather than built through will. You have shown me something entirely different. A strength built through patience, through discipline, through the sheer refusal to accept the limitations others tried to place upon you. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his, a gesture of tenderness he had rarely allowed himself throughout their careful, evolving relationship. Whatever the outcome tomorrow, know that you have already proven something far more significant than any duel could measure. You have proven that the strength this kingdom has always valued was never the only kind worth possessing. Elena felt tears prick unexpectedly behind her eyes, moved by the sincerity in his words, so different from the cold distance that had defined their earliest days together. Thank you, she whispered, for believing in me, even when I struggled to fully believe in myself. They stood together a while longer in the quiet clearing, gathering strength from each other's presence, before finally making their way back toward the fortress, hand in hand, ready as they would ever be for whatever trial the following day would bring. The morning of the duel dawned clear and bitterly cold, pale winter sunlight breaking over a wide open field that had been chosen as neutral ground between the two kingdoms, marked by ancient stone pillars that had witnessed formal duels for generations beyond count. Elena stood at the edge of the field as the sun climbed higher, watching the crowds gather steadily along the perimeter. Wolves from both Shadowfall and Ashbourne territory, arriving in growing numbers, along with representatives from several neighboring kingdoms, drawn by curiosity or political interest in the outcome. Her breath formed small clouds in the cold air, as she ran through the familiar forms Corvin had drilled into her over the past months, her body loose and ready, despite the nervous energy coursing beneath her calm exterior. Corvin stood beside her, offering final quiet words of guidance, while Damien remained close on her other side, his presence a steady, grounding force amid the mounting tension of the gathering crowd. "Remember what we discussed," Corvin said quietly. "Let him come to you in the early exchanges. Conserve your strength. His confidence will work against him if you remain patient enough to let it." "I remember," Elena confirmed, forcing her voice to remain steady, despite the pounding of her own heart. Across the field, the Ashbourne delegation arrived with considerable fanfare, banners bearing their kingdom's sigil snapping in the cold wind, as Cale Ashbourne himself strode forward to take his position at the opposite edge of the dueling ground. He was an imposing figure, tall and heavily muscled, moving with the effortless, predatory confidence of someone who had never once doubted his own dominance in a physical confrontation. His dark eyes found Elena across the distance, and something like amused disdain flickered across his features as he studied her, clearly unconcerned by the prospect of facing an opponent he considered beneath serious consideration. "So the rumors were true," Cale called out, his voice carrying easily across the open field, pitched to ensure the gathered crowd heard every word. "Shadowfall truly intends to send its human bride to answer my challenge. I confess, I did not expect such an entertaining spectacle." A ripple of laughter moved through portions of the Ashbourne delegation, though Elena noticed, with quiet satisfaction, that the Shadowfall crowd remained largely silent, watching her with a mixture of hope and lingering uncertainty, rather than shared amusement. "I look forward to demonstrating precisely how mistaken your expectations are," Elena called back, her voice carrying clearly, despite the nervous tightness in her chest. Cale's smile widened, though something flickered briefly behind his confident expression, perhaps the faintest hint of surprise at her steady defiance. "Bold words," he said, from someone about to learn a painful lesson about the difference between human ambition and true strength. The formal ceremony began shortly after, an elderly official from a neutral territory stepping forward to recite the ancient rules governing royal duels, the boundaries of acceptable technique, the conditions under which victory would be formally declared. Elena listened with careful attention despite the mounting tension coursing through her body, running through Corvin's careful guidance one final time, as the ceremonial preparations concluded. Damien caught her hand briefly before she stepped onto the dueling ground, his gray eyes holding hers with fierce intensity. "You are more prepared for this than you know," he said quietly. "Trust everything we have built together, trust yourself." Elena nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence, before finally stepping forward onto the open field, leaving the safety of the gathered crowd behind, as she took her position opposite Cale Ashbourne, the vast expanse of the dueling ground stretching between them. The official raised a hand, calling for silence across the assembled crowd, and Elena felt the world narrow around her, every sound fading except for her own steady breathing and the pounding rhythm of her heart. Then the hand dropped, signaling the formal beginning of the duel, and Cale moved. He came at her exactly as Damien's reports had predicted, aggressive and overwhelming from the opening moments, seeking to end the confrontation quickly, through sheer physical dominance. Elena's instincts, honed through months of relentless training, took over almost before her conscious mind could fully process the incoming attack, her body shifting and redirecting the force of his initial strike, rather than attempting to meet it directly, absorbing the momentum and using it to slip past his guard, rather than confronting his considerable strength head-on. Cale stumbled slightly, genuine surprise flashing across his features at the unexpected evasion, before recovering quickly and pressing forward with renewed aggression. Elena continued her careful, measured approach, conserving her energy exactly as Corvin had drilled into her, avoiding direct confrontations of strength, and instead relying on precise timing and calculated positioning to slip past his attacks, landing quick, controlled strikes of her own whenever opportunities presented themselves. The crowd's initial murmurs of surprise grew steadily louder as the exchange continued, minutes stretching into what felt like an eternity, as Elena continued evading Cale's increasingly frustrated assaults, refusing to be drawn into the kind of direct, brute force confrontation that would inevitably favor his considerable physical advantages. She could see the frustration building visibly in his expression, his confident smile fading into something harder, more determined, as the duel stretched on far longer than he had clearly anticipated. "Stand and fight properly," Cale snarled at one point, his composure fraying, as another of his heavy strikes met only empty air where Elena had stood a moment before. "This cowardly dance proves nothing." "Patience is not cowardice," Elena replied, circling carefully, her breathing controlled despite the growing exhaustion building in her limbs. "It is simply strategy, though I understand that concept may be unfamiliar to someone who has never faced genuine resistance before." The words clearly struck a nerve, and Cale's next assault came with even greater force, his careful control finally beginning to crack under the mounting frustration of facing an opponent who refused to fight on his preferred terms. It was precisely the opening Corvin had predicted would eventually come, and Elena felt her training take over completely, as Cale overextended himself in a powerful, committed strike, his balance shifting in a way that left him momentarily vulnerable. She moved instinctively, exactly as she had during those long months of training in the quiet clearing, using leverage and precise timing, rather than raw strength, to redirect the full force of his own momentum against him. Cale's considerable weight, combined with the power of his overextended strike, sent him stumbling forward off balance, and Elena capitalized on the opening immediately, sweeping his legs from beneath him with a controlled, decisive movement that sent the much larger, much stronger Alpha King crashing to the frozen ground. A stunned silence fell over the entire gathered crowd as Cale Ashbourne, renowned for his brutal, undefeated strength, found himself flat on his back for the first time in years, staring up in genuine shock at the human woman standing over him, her breathing hard, but her stance controlled and steady. He recovered quickly, fury replacing shock as he scrambled back to his feet, but the momentary loss of composure had shifted something fundamental in the confrontation. Elena pressed her advantage carefully, continuing to rely on the same patient, calculated strategy that had brought her this far, refusing to let his renewed aggression draw her into a direct confrontation of strength she could not hope to win. The duel continued for several more tense minutes, Cale's attacks growing increasingly desperate, as his earlier confidence crumbled beneath the mounting realization that his assumed victory was far from certain. Elena, drawing on every reserve of strength and discipline she had built over the preceding months, continued her measured, patient approach, watching for the openings Corvin's training had taught her to recognize, absorbing what she could not avoid entirely, and redirecting force wherever possible, rather than meeting it head-on. The final decisive moment came as Cale, driven by mounting frustration and wounded pride, committed to one final, overwhelming assault, abandoning the careful control that had once defined his fighting style entirely. Elena saw the opening the moment it presented itself, exactly as Corvin had promised she eventually would, and she moved with complete, focused precision, redirecting his powerful strike, using his own considerable momentum against him one final time, sending him crashing to the ground with enough decisive force that he did not immediately rise. The official rushed forward, examining Cale carefully, before raising his hand and declaring, in a voice that carried clearly across the stunned silence of the gathered crowd, that the duel had reached its formal conclusion. Elena Marsh, human bride of Alpha King Damian Cross, had defeated Cale Ashbourne in fair and formal combat. For a long moment, the entire field remained frozen in stunned silence, the enormity of what had just occurred settling slowly over the gathered crowd from both kingdoms. Then, breaking through the silence, a single voice rose in celebration from among the Shadowfall delegation, quickly joined by others, until the entire crowd erupted into a roar of astonished, jubilant celebration, unlike anything Elena had witnessed since her arrival in this world. Damian crossed the field at a run, reaching her just as her legs finally began to tremble with exhaustion and adrenaline, catching her steady as relief and disbelief and overwhelming pride washed over his features all at once. "You did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he pulled her close. "Elena, you actually did it." "I told you I was prepared," Elena managed, laughing breathlessly despite her exhaustion, tears of relief and triumph finally slipping free as the reality of what she had accomplished began to fully settle over her. Around them, The celebration continued to build, Shadowfall wolves, who had once doubted her worth, now watching with open astonishment and growing respect, while the Ashbourne delegation retreated in stunned, humiliated silence, their king's defeat marking a decisive and undeniable shift in the balance of power between the two kingdoms. In the weeks that followed the duel, the transformation within Shadowfall's walls was nothing short of remarkable. News of Elena's victory spread rapidly beyond the borders of both kingdoms, carried by traveling merchants and diplomatic messengers to every corner of the wider wolf territories, until her name became synonymous with a kind of strength few had ever expected to encounter in a human. The contested border territory formally passed into Shadowfall's recognized control, exactly as the terms of the duel had promised, and Kael Ashbourne's kingdom, humiliated by the decisive defeat of their renowned Alpha King, entered into a careful new period of diplomacy, no longer testing Shadowfall's borders with the same bold aggression that had defined the months before the duel. Within the fortress itself, the shift in how Elena was perceived proved equally dramatic. Guards who had once regarded her with barely concealed skepticism now offered genuine respect, some even requesting, with careful humility, that she might share some insight into the discipline and strategy that had allowed her to overcome such an imposing physical disadvantage. The council, once dismissive of her presence in their formal sessions, now actively sought her perspective on matters ranging from border strategy to diplomatic relations with neighboring kingdoms, recognizing in her the same sharp intelligence and careful observation that had first begun winning Damien's respect so many months earlier. Even Celine Voss, though her pride would never allow her to fully abandon her earlier skepticism, found herself unable to maintain the same open disdain that had once characterized every interaction between them. When their paths crossed at a formal gathering some weeks after the duel, Celine approached with uncharacteristic hesitation, studying Elena with an expression that carried, for the first time, something resembling genuine respect. "I confess," Celine said, her tone lacking its usual cutting edge, "I did not believe you capable of what you accomplished against Kael Ashbourne. Few among our own warriors could claim such a decisive victory against him." "I understand your skepticism," Elena replied evenly, though she allowed a small measure of warmth to color her response. "I gave you little reason to expect otherwise, in those early months." "Perhaps," Celine said, something almost like a genuine smile touching her lips, "though I begin to suspect fate chose more wisely than any of us initially gave it credit for." It was not quite friendship, not immediately, but it marked the beginning of a genuine thaw in what had once been an entirely hostile relationship, one that would continue to soften gradually in the months that followed, as Elena's place within Shadowfall's court became increasingly secure and respected. The most significant transformation, however, unfolded not within the wider court, but within the quiet, private moments Elena continued to share with Damien in the weeks following her victory. What had begun as a marriage of cold obligation, shaped entirely by the demands of fate and political necessity, had grown, through months of shared struggle and growing understanding, into something neither of them had dared hope for during those first difficult weeks of her arrival. On a clear evening some months after the duel, as winter finally began loosening its grip and the first signs of spring touched the fortress gardens, Damien called for a formal gathering of the entire Shadowfall court, an announcement, he explained cryptically to Elena beforehand, that he wished to make before the full assembly of nobles and advisors who had witnessed every step of her difficult journey within these walls. Elena stood beside him at the head of the great hall, the same hall where she had first stood so many months earlier, trembling with fear, before a court that had doubted her worth entirely. The transformation in how that same court now regarded her was almost impossible to fully comprehend. The skepticism and quiet mockery of that first day replaced now by genuine respect and, in many faces, open admiration. "When fate first bound Elena Marsh to my future," Damien began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent, attentive hall, "I confess, I saw only obligation in that bond, a duty I could not refuse regardless of my own reservations. I did not choose her, and for a time, I allowed that lack of choice to blind me to the extraordinary person fate had actually placed before me." He turned to face Elena directly, his gray eyes carrying an open warmth that had nothing to do with formal duty or political necessity. "Over these months, I have watched Elena face doubt and cruelty with unwavering dignity. I have watched her build strength from nothing, through sheer discipline and determination, until she stood before an alpha king renowned for his brutality, and proved, beyond any doubt, that strength takes many forms beyond what this kingdom has traditionally valued. And somewhere throughout that journey, without my fully realizing it was happening, I fell deeply and completely in love with her, not out of obligation, but out of genuine, undeniable choice. A soft murmur of surprise and warmth moved through the gathered court, and Elena felt tears gathering unexpectedly behind her eyes at the sincerity in his words, so far removed from the cold distance that had defined their earliest days together. Before this entire court, Damien continued, I wish to formally and publicly claim Elena not simply as the mate fate assigned to me, but as the true queen this kingdom is fortunate to have found, chosen freely and completely, out of love rather than obligation. The hall erupted into genuine warm applause, entirely different from the polite, skeptical acknowledgement that had greeted their original wedding so many months earlier. Elena, overwhelmed by the sincerity and warmth surrounding her, found herself laughing through unexpected tears as Damien pulled her close, sealing his declaration with a gentle kiss that spoke of everything neither of them had fully allowed themselves to voice until this moment. In the months and years that followed, Elena Marsh's story became something of legend throughout the Wolf Kingdoms, told and retold as an example of how strength could take forms far different from what tradition and expectation typically demanded. She continued her training under Corvin's guidance, eventually becoming a respected voice in matters of both strategy and diplomacy, her unique perspective, as someone who had crossed between two entirely different worlds, proving invaluable in navigating the complex politics that continued to shape relations between the various wolf territories. She never forgot those difficult early months, the humiliation and doubt that had once threatened to overwhelm her, the cold distance that had once defined her marriage to a man who saw her only as unwanted obligation. But she carried those memories not with bitterness, but with quiet gratitude for the journey that had ultimately led her to this place, standing beside a partner who had learned, alongside her, that true strength was never measured simply in speed, or claws, or inherited bloodline, but in the quiet, unwavering resolve to become more than what others believed you capable of, regardless of how impossible that transformation might once have seemed. The human queen who had once been dismissed as fragile and weak had proven, beyond any doubt, that she belonged not despite what she was, but because of the extraordinary strength she had carried within herself all along, waiting only for the chance to be revealed.